All right. Um, I envision a relatively busy meeting in terms of the stuff we have to cover today, so we will jump right in, starting with our antitrust policy notice. We show this at the beginning of every meeting. You can find the full Linux Foundation antitrust policy on the website. And if you're from a member company, you can contact our counsel, Andy Updegrove, on any matters you may have. Now, this is the monthly call for North America and Asia. And that means we are going to be focusing on spec editing. Our format is always the same. We have news, work on standards and core material, space for any other business, and then we close the meeting. Now, on the news front, just like on the earlier call we had for North America and Europe at the beginning of October, I want to keep it simple. The news is nice and tidy. Our security specification, which was submitted to ISO at the beginning of the year, is about to be formally published by them as an ISO standard in early November, according to the latest messaging. So we're now just a couple of weeks away from having the ISO number formally granted to us. That's a nice step forward for the project. It will be our second ISO standard. At the same time, I wanted to flag that the Open Compliance Summit, which is held in Tokyo on the 7th and 8th of December this year, is about to announce its schedule. Now, this event for people in Asia provides an excellent venue for sharing knowledge and networking. And the schedule that will be announced looks pretty spectacular this year. It's a very international event, and a lot of key thinkers will be present. Now, of course, there's a lot of other things happening, but I wanted to keep it simple and focus on the most important takeaways that you should have. What I do want to do for this meeting is to focus on our work around our standards and core material. There's a lot of interesting stuff going on, and we are in the position of updating existing specifications and addressing proposals for new specifications. Let's have a look at what happens next. So formally speaking, we're working on proposals for updates to our license compliance and security specifications. That would be the third generation for license compliance and the second generation for security. We're working on a proposal for a contribution process management specification, and we're working on a proposal for an SBOM quality specification. When it comes specifically to what we'll do on this call, we're going to be looking at license, security, and contribution. The telco SBOM specification is still in a discussion period on the telco list, and we will have a call probably later this month to have a kickoff around what's going to happen on that telco spec, what's the appropriate thing that the stakeholders want. So our focus today, license, security, and contribution. All of the proposals for updates or new specifications are things we work on to put before the steering committee, and that will be in early December around the Open Compliance Summit. The steering committee has the formal duty to vote on things and provide guidance on where we go next. So we're working on proposals, and we're working on them for the OpenChain project steering committee to formally review at end of year. Now, the licensing and security specifications are naturally the core of what we do. I have just copied and pasted the current versions of those standards into the meeting chat. And we have the draft future versions. So these are the proposals for the future. And I'm putting those in the chat now. So we're working on those future version drafts. And pretty much, pretty specifically, I've picked two open issues for us to have a look at today, which I think might be useful and fun to review. At this point in time, we're reviewing some open issues that are pre-existing on our tracker, and they are items to close off. They're housekeeping items that we have to review. I put those into the chat, and we will turn to the contribution spec a little bit later in this call. Let's go straight in and have a look at the first items that I brought up. And the first item that I brought in there, I think, would be the licensing spec, and it is a proposal we have to harmonize the objectives. And I'll just open that up. Right. So issue 58. This comes from Marcel at PwC, and he's just noting that in the license compliance spec 1.3, it's requested to be aware of relevant open source objectives, but we do not mention the objectives anywhere else within the requirements section. So he's suggesting that we add objectives to the program scope 1.4, and we mention objectives in policy, so 1.1. Let's take a look at what that would mean. Kubota-san just put a note about the telco spec, so we're going to come back to that at the any other business section of the call. That note came through the meeting chat. Thank you, Kubota-san. That's great. Okay, so on the license compliance, basically we do not add objectives into scope and policy in the existing document, and Marcel is saying we should do that. So let's have a look at 1.4 and 1.1. So 1.4, that's interesting. His numbering is, I think he meant 3.1.4, yeah. Okay, 3.1.1, policy. And he's saying that he'd like objectives to be added to that. Let's have a look at where. In the policy, he'd say the verification material should be a documented policy that reflects scope, objectives, and limits of the program. Right now, yes, it just says a documented open source policy. Okay, so he wants to change that, a documented open source policy, into something that says a documented open source policy that reflects the scope, objectives, and limits of the program. That's interesting. I think that makes a lot of sense. What do you think? The specific change, for those wondering, would be exactly this. There you go. We'd be changing from that to that. It seems to me that any policy should reflect the scope, objectives, and limits of a program. So it's uncontroversial to add that text, and it adds clarification that objectives should be considered. Does anyone think that that, instead of increasing clarity, would either be too prescriptive or cause other issues?
I think it's a good reminder that it's something that they probably should consider.
Yeah, it's a good point, Chris. It seems to me that if, our assumption was that everyone making a policy would know that a policy should have objectives in it, but being explicit seems to never hurt in standardization.
Right.
Okay, if there's no objection to that, then provisionally that's where we're going. Let's have a look at the program scope as well. 3.4 program scope. So program scope is asking for a written statement that defines the scope and limits of the program. And Marcel is suggesting that we change that. My apologies, I'm just messing around with the numbers here. We change that and it becomes from a written statement that clearly defines the scope and limits of the program, becomes a written statement that clearly defines the scope, objectives, and limits of the program. Again, that seems kind of like a no-brainer. It seems utterly harmless. So remember, the intent here is just to make sure that we refer to people should have awareness of their open source objectives, but in the rest of the document, we didn't mention anything about the objectives. So this would be just explicitly saying that your policy and your written statement should consider the objectives. And both of those language proposals look harmless and positively additive to me. But does anyone have any objections, or are you okay for us to continue with this?
I'm good.
All right. I'm just going to make a note of what call this is. I can't believe it's October 17th.
Time flies when you're having fun.
Yeah. I mean, I would counter I'm not having fun. I had all my luggage stolen in Germany 3 weeks ago. And then everything gone, suits, cameras, everything. And I came back to Japan and I was like, okay, first thing I'm going to buy a new camera. Bought a new camera, flew to Hong Kong for business, came back from Hong Kong, unpacked the camera. All of the lens glass fell out. It was broken.
Oh no.
Yeah.
That's terrible. I'm sorry to hear that.
Yeah.
My wife says I'm cursed and she's going to take me to a shrine for a cleansing.
Yeah. And you probably should let her have the camera.
Yeah. Just if you see me and if I've got anything valuable in my hands or within a couple of meters, just take it away. Just wheel it away. Right now is a bad time for me to be near anything precious. Apart from ISO standards. It's okay with ISO standards. There's enough safeguards. All right, the change is accepted, and I'll update the document with these two. So I'm actually going to add that to the document after the call. But basically, we've added the two items. We've closed that issue for Marcel, and it's nice and tidy. Now, to go back to our main document, the next thing we have a look at is security and issue 17. So I'll just put that in the chat again because we've moved down a bit on the chat since I last posted it. And let's go have a look at that. So issue 17 on security is to do with the 18-month limit for reviewing. Is this spec current? And we check every 18 months. But there's a potential issue with the verification materials and the main requirement in section 342. Let's have a look at that. 342 duration. Okay.
Yep.
So here's our issue. We have a duration here that you get a check 18 months from the first certification, 24 months from the second certification, 36 months from the third certification, and requires review every 36 months after that. However, our verification material is asking for review every 18 months. So in other words, our cadence is wrong. The verification material is referring to the fact that we used to just ask that you'd refresh or review your conformance every 18 months. And for one reason or another, we put the requirement in the draft spec that you do that at a different cadence, 18, then 24, then 36 months, then 36 hereafter. So
That was
This,
definitely a miss.
yeah, that's a miss. So how do we fix that? Shall we just put it 18 months? People should check the document every 18 months. That would be, I think, the same as license compliance. Let me have a quick look at license compliance. Yeah,
It
license
is.
compliance is every 18 months.
Mm-hmm.
So what do you think? Should we just run with that and align them, or should we keep the more stepped certification period here?
Is this a review period by the certifying body?
It could be, or self-certification. It's not prescriptive. So it would be a review, and ultimately we would leave what that review is up to the supply chain. So the supplier and customer company would decide what's appropriate. Because of course we don't want to mandate that people have to go through expensive third-party certification on a frequent basis. But in this case, the review could be internal if your customers were okay with it, and you'd just be verifying that you still are meeting the spec, that you haven't lost the policy down the back of the sofa or something.
Right. So 3421 is just actually talking about the verification material. You've got to put together a document affirming that you met
Right.
those requirements. Yeah, so I think the same time period would be consistent.
Okay. Yeah, I figure so too. I mean, ultimately, this is to make the company sit up and just make sure that they haven't messed around, that they don't say they're conformant and then completely forget about it.
Mm-hmm.
So every 18 months seems reasonable. Okay, so in that case, the proposal on the table is on our draft security spec, we have a goof with a stepped cadence for checking if you're conformant with the standard, but the verification material referred to 18 months instead of a stepped cadence. So the proposal on the table is we stop trying to be clever and we just use the exact same language as we have in the licensing spec, just 18 months, no stepped cadence. You have 18 months to verify that you meet the requirements. So every 18 months, you do a verification. If there's no objections, then we will.
Is there any hint of why that stepped cadence was put into the spec? Was it like to allow for some different level of depth of inspection or verification, like a review light and full review? I'm just curious how it originated.
It's a very good question, Jacob. And if I recall correctly, and we can do a formal check on this later, if I recall correctly, we basically were looking at that with the optic of how to put companies into a maintenance mode as opposed to a continuous verification cycle. And I think perhaps our mental modeling in the work group at the time was that it might be a third-party certifier coming in, and that in the beginning you might need that more often, and then after that less frequently. But it is out of alignment with where we go with the licensing doc, which is where we don't specify third-party or internal check. We just specify that every 18 months you do that health check and make sure you're conformant.
And I think that security is very important, and so it probably needs the same attention to detail every 18 months as for even just to have an internal check and go through and make sure everything is proper is probably the right thing to do. They don't have
Yeah,
to be formal.
because a lot of wheels can come off in 3 years.
Yes, absolutely.
Right. I like the idea of staying consistent, and then if there's any maintenance mode or surveillance activities, just explicitly call those out later on.
That's a good point. We can build on this with the explicit call outs with a further point in the duration if we want to down the line. Yep. Okay. In that case, you know, I'm just going to put a note. I got to double check that the language is consistent. All right. All right. So just looking at license compliance, if we take the exact thing, our new language will be, trying to make this larger. Our new language will be this. A program that is OpenChain conformant with this version of the specification shall last 18 months from the date conformance validation was obtained. Not sure about this procedure on the website. I think that might be too prescriptive, because surely the conformant validation registration procedure will be dependent on the companies in play. They might decide to do whatever they want. But anyway, we can leave that in for now, align the specs. And then the verification materials will be a document affirming that the program meets all the requirements of the document within the past 18 months of obtaining conformance validation. So it's an 18-month cycle. There's a conformance validation every 18 months, and that would make us in sync with the licensing spec.
Do you think it's a little confusing to have the word document twice in that sentence there?
Yeah, I really do. How about we say specification?
Yeah, that's what I was thinking.
And I can go and fix licensing as well with this. So
make one licensing specification and one assurance specification or security. Yeah.
Okay. All right. So then that would say, could say security spec, or it could just be saying just spec, but either works for me. All right, that's looking a lot better. Yeah. And I'll align the licensing with the security. Should we keep this language, conformance validation registration procedure, which in practice is our self-certification questionnaire, or use a third party? But do we even need that language? I'm saying that because I wonder if we're going too far to the how as opposed to the what. Surely the conformance validation procedure isn't truly the business of the spec maker.
That's true.
Yeah, and I mean, in a highly regulated industry, their conformance validation is likely to be a multi-stage process, but someone making a random, MP3 player, their conformance validation will be much later. Okay, I propose that we do that. Does anyone have any objections with that chop? So that will be moving the conformance validation as something that's prescribed on our website into being something that you determine. That's up to you. Now, the description on our website is basically saying you can self-certify or talk to a third-party certifier. I'm just saying that perhaps inside the spec, we shouldn't put that there. If people go to our website, they can find out a route. But by the same token, perhaps conformance validation could take a completely different avenue for an org in a different industry. For example, a space component supplier, like, and randomly picking here, like Boeing, in aviation and I believe space too, there's whole sections of Boeing that essentially have different departments check each other, right? Their conformance validation on different things is done internally because the expertise is internal. which would be outside of our suggestion of our document on our website for self-certification or a third-party certifier. Is that nuts, or does it make any sense?
Yeah,
Makes sense. I didn't know that validation process existed, but it makes sense.
it's kind of like a contribution policy. You know, you can have an example on the website so people can find it, but you don't have to put the whole thing in the spec, all the details.
Yep. So I guess what I should do as a takeaway is if we remove that, but I also try to explicitly call out on the website a much clearer example of conformance validation, maybe into the FAQ or similar.
Yeah, that'd probably be helpful.
So then we're moving that purely to and we're moving it purely to reference material, but we're making it better. Okay, that's looking pretty good. So that will align the two specs and it will reduce by one sentence. Massive win in every direction. Okay, so actually now we're on to the contribution spec. So this is something that is a proposal for a new specification. And that proposal is in very early days. So I'm just putting the links in here. There was a GitHub issue to explain the proposal. There was a kickoff call to formally begin talking about it. So to move it over to our review thread, where it becomes an actual proposal from OpenChain. And there is a specific issue to review today, issue 16, which I shall bring up now in just a single moment. So the contribution spec has been a little bit controversial for people, and this is normal. I mean, people propose a new spec, and some people say yes, and some people say no. But there was a lot of controversy about how that contribution spec could or should work, or should it not. And one of the things that appeared to be very heated was that people had different ideas of what contribution was and why it mattered and how it mattered. And for some parties, contribution was tied to, let's say, how do I interact with open source projects in a more normative way? And for other parties, contribution was purely, how does my corporate entity move IP? And Jimmy, who proposed the contribution spec, noted that the imperfect alignment on defining contribution in the context of this proposal was causing the discussion to have people talking sideways, essentially. And he suggests that contribution in the context of this proposal should be outbound delivery of proprietary material. So that's to move from proprietary internal material into something external under an open source license. So he's suggesting that contribution be purely defined as the transfer of IPR from internal to external under open source license. And what are the key things that a company needs to think about when it's about to take those IPR actions? And here he is purposefully excluding spinning up new projects or similar things. And he's therefore saying that he understands not everyone defines contribution in this manner. And for that reason, we should either set a definition of contribution or rename this work outbound open source processes. And to use that as a way to align people around a clear common vision of what the proposal is for. So to recap, contribution seems to mean different things to different people. Jimmy is suggesting we take a step back and we talk about contribution, or his intent is that this proposal talks about contribution as outbound delivery of internal IPR to external projects under open source licenses. So IP transfer into open source. And that would be suggesting that this IP transfer requires a basic policy, processes to manage it, and to ensure that there's named parties behind it. Hand up there on Chris. Chris, over to you.
I'm afraid that to me that smacks too much of being too one-sided, because there are a number of foundations, groups, and organizations out there, open source organizations, that have contribution policies, and they don't really care whether it's coming from a commercial company or from people who they just don't know, who want to make a contribution to do a bug fix, to do an enhancement. You know, they don't want to become a full-time member, but they'd like to be able to contribute to the project. So I think he's got the wording is kind of tightly bound to only organizations with proprietary copyrighted material. Whereas as an open source developer, I could want to participate with another open source organization that has a contribution policy, and you have to sign that thing, that you're agreeing to their rules of the road for contributing software to them. Like some of them require that you can only use their license, and you have to just turn it over to them. And so there's different effects within the open source community. But I agree, it also equally applies to organizations that do have proprietary copywritten material.
That's a really good point. So maybe then, if we tried to redefine contribution, we'd be putting a ring fence around it in a way that excludes a lot of contribution as it's understood. So then do you think maybe the outbound open source process is a better description? Oh, Jacob's hand is up as well. Jacob.
It seems as if we've reached our our gratis and libre moment. Is this free as in freedom or free as in beer, where we either need to define it as both or define it as a fork in the road here? It's an interesting situation.
Yeah, this is like the discussion between free and open source software and freeware.
Yeah.
It's getting to be, let's divide the baby up so we can precisely define the fact that it's got dark hair and dark eyes.
That's a good point. Yeah. As a political scientist, whenever there's a fork in the road that involves taking a side, I suggest we sidestep it.
Oh, where did you go to school? Princeton?
One of these creatures. So I suggest we maybe run with this, the outbound open source process as a name instead of contribution process. We just say outbound open source process spec, and this would suggest that it's simply an add-on to licensing or security. But if you're doing outbound, you also have a look at this document.
Well, let me play the devil's advocate there for just a second. If I have an outbound open source process, does that mean that I can only contribute software to somebody else? See, there's an inbound that also goes with it, and it depends on who's got the process. Do I have the process, or do you have the process? If you have it, then I want to contribute it.
That's a really good point.
So it comes back to the same thing Jacob was just talking about.
Mm-hmm.
I think we've come to a fork in the road.
What about from a global perspective, like a global language perspective? Is there something that's a more appropriate term that translates globally? Because if contribution is a confusing term for us, how is it in different languages?
Yeah. Yep.
That's a good question.
I think in that case, we need to do more research on this. Uh, work better. So our discussion indicates contribution is too loaded, and by narrowly putting in the narrowly defining it, we would excluding. Okay. Outbound work, but
That only works for somebody that's trying to give the software, though.
yep. Yep, it would have to explicitly be called out that this is simply a discussion around giving IP to other parties, not about inbound and not about non-corporate use. So again, it would need qualifiers.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Jacob,
because
sorry, oh, Chris, sorry, go ahead. I apologize. There's a bit of a delay.
No, that's fine. Because an organization that primarily develops what we'll call proprietary software, which is closed source, may not have or want a contribution policy other than their contractual relationships with their known suppliers. But the first question out of an attorney's mouth is always, does the open source group have a contribution policy? And they want to know that because they want to know what are the rules that they're agreeing to, or the corporation's agreeing to, by saying, yeah, we're going to contribute software to your organization. If they have no contribution policy and they're willing to accept it under your license, then you may be a lot more willing to say, okay, I'm going to put this under the MIT or a BSD 2-clause license and be done with it. But if you're going to put it underneath the server-side license or the Affero GPL, they might say, man, not so fast.
Absolutely. Jacob, is your hand up for this issue as well?
Oh, nope, sorry. I need to lower it.
Kubota-san has a contribution to the contribution discussion too. He's saying that for his company, creating issues on GitHub, sending a comment to a mailing list are also contribution, so that it's very difficult to define contribution for his company.
Yeah, okay. He is right.
Yep, that does look solid.
And some of those places where you're making a comment or adding a problem statement to something, if you read the fine print on the receiver's website, it says anything that you put in here is our property.
Yep.
I won't name any companies that do that.
So the overview would be seems too wide as a term. Outbound is narrower, but would need further. So basically, we're down to contribution. Looks like it doesn't work as a term. Oh, Yeah. So it looks like contribution doesn't work as a term. Outbound is narrower, but still needs further definition before it works. And it leaves a bunch of unanswered questions like, if there's an outbound guide, where's the inbound guide, et cetera, et cetera. And
Mm-hmm.
yeah. So I'll put that in.
You're going to preclude somebody from writing up another issue, number 17.
Preemptive strike here.
There you go.
All right. So yeah, it looks like it needs work. We had another comment in, I think this is from King, that it's the same for his company. Contribution can be creating issues or sending comments. Fukuchi-san noted that he'd like to promote community engagement before contributing code. Fukuchi-san, I think that's a very valid stance, but what we're trying to do, I think what I described, we're trying to do right now is purely on the corporate IP management side. So, how's my risk exposure here, as opposed to the community engagement side, which would be much more of a developer team optimization decision. So, I concur with you, but I think that the promotion of community engagement probably belongs with like the to-do group contribution guides, the normative side saying contribution is good, but you have to learn the community. Here's how to learn the community, et cetera, et cetera. Where on our side right now, we're looking at the what, which would be the company has decided, so it's already had a proposal that contribution is something to think about, and the company is going to make a policy, which could be absolutely not, never, under no circumstances ever do that. Or more likely it would be more nuanced. But
Well,
we're looking at purely the what.
yeah, it's like if you're using NumPy or SciPy or one of those little tools that does fun things for you in scientific land. There may be a function that's inside of it that it accomplishes that doesn't quite work. It's a little more restrictive maybe than you think it should be, and you found a way to make it a little looser. And so instead of readjusting NumPy every time you bring a new version in, you contribute the change to that group and let them fold it in so that they're maintaining it, so that they always make sure that the code is working when they release the next release. And that way you don't have to continually go back and upgrade your own version of it every time. So those are the kind of things that drive a lot of contribution from the commercial side into open source.
Yep.
Sorry.
No, it's a really good point. And I think that we're at the situation where, engineering might come to you and say, we're sick of applying a patch every time. We need to put this somewhere.
That's exactly correct.
And then legal and IP needs to have something they can grab and say, okay, those goofball engineers want to do something again. How do we contain it?
Yeah, and there are a number of different contribution policies that are out there in the wild. If you look at all of the repositories and all the people that are maintaining them, they've all got their own spin on how they would like to receive the software when it's being contributed to them. Do they want you to maintain it? Do they want to maintain it totally and have total control over it? I mean, there's 1,000 ways to slice the duck. So,
Yeah. And I suppose one thing that's important here is that our existing licensing spec says have a contribution policy and stops. And the reason this contribution discussion is underway is because guiding IP and legal to have a policy and then stop has proven to be inadequate for at least some companies that are saying we'd like some more help. We'd like some more standards of how we do that. How do we get to the contribution policy and processes that support it?
mm-hmm.
But again, what we're looking at here in this proposal, and it's only a proposal, but this proposal would be that IP and legal and CTO office are able to pick up further guidance from the international market on the contribution side that pushes them closer to what we expect in the open source community, but it doesn't control them. So, we begin to give them a path to moving the IP into open source, and then the normative side, how much they want to contribute, how much they want to be a community player, still remains their own business, but they have an on-ramp that gets them started.
Mm-hmm.
Yep. But the outcome of our conversation is that the terms don't seem to work yet. Let's see. All right. So our discussion says contribution is too loaded. Narrowly defining it, we'd be excluding real world use cases like project contribution. And creating issues and sending comments can also be regarded as contribution. So contribution doesn't look like the right term. Open source, outbound open source processes may work, but can it be understood, and would it need qualifiers for outbound? For inbound? If there's an outbound guide, where's the inbound guide? And therefore, contribution seems to be too wide a term. Outbound is narrower, but needs further examination. And it appears to require further adjustment. So contribution, not suitable. Outbound, maybe, but it still doesn't seem clear enough. People aren't immediately understanding it, and it provokes other questions like, okay, where's my inbound?
Yeah. Yeah, it's gonna, for most large organizations, commercial organizations, it's going to get very into the weeds with contracts and the legal departments in structuring how they want to handle contribution policies that the open source world has. Because other than open source, we don't worry about contribution policies. But the first time that an engineer wants to contribute something to the Apache Foundation, to whatever group it happens to be, the first question that they get is, do they have a contribution policy? And if so, I need to see it.
Yep.
Who needs to sign it? Do we need to indemnify anybody? So, there's a series of questions that are driven by the legal and contracts type people on what questions they want answered before you give your intellectual property away. Even if it's not crown jewels, anything that you copyright is technically intellectual property. So,
Absolutely.
do they allow you to leave your copyright on it when you that's another question. But is it still our intellectual property? And then do we want to copyright it to you, the author, or do we want to copy it to the copywriter for the company? There's a million different questions, and I don't think we could ever, in a non-prescriptive specification, be doing it justice to try and address all of those issues.
Yep.
Okay, I'll be quiet.
No. I'm agreeing with you. No, I mean, I tend to think that we're at that dangerous moment, which I put here. We're easily veering into how rather than what.
Yep.
By touching on this.
Mm-hmm.
And if we can't separate those two, then this might simply not belong in the domain where we operate. We might be able to say, look, in the end, you can't talk about this without doing how. So we have to go back and give it to someone who does how, like To Do Group. Give them the knowledge we've got here, but we can't make a spec out of it. Yeah.
And I think it's more important for OpenChain conformance, for open source organizations, whether they're part of OpenChain or whether they're part of one of those other organizations, Eclipse or Apache, to have a contribution policy if they want one.
Yep.
But it certainly isn't necessary from their perspective, but it makes doing business easier. But from an organizational process, I can't think of a reason why a commercial entity would actually want a contribution policy. They'd want to understand the contribution policy of the organization that they're trying to share their IP with.
Okay, that sounds good. Yep. I think that's as far as we can get today. Basically saying, I'll just make a note of the call on. Okay, so basically we're saying that this is a thorny topic, needs global check, and it basically looks like the terminology still is not tying us down in a clear enough way at this time. All right. In that case, I think the comment is in. We're done. That actually concludes our main business of this call, but we do have an any other business section, and we have an any other business item. Kubota-san pointed out that the telco spec has a discussion about what to do next, and that's the other draft spec under proposal. It's about SBOM quality. And I've just put the URL in the chat that has the outcomes of a significant meeting on the 5th of October. And that meeting seems to highlight some issues. And Kubota-san raised some issues. I'm putting them in the chat for easy reading. Basically, the telco spec is SPDX only, but some people are using Cyclone. The version of the spec used is important to consider. If there's no telco specifics, this should be coordinated more globally, including with initiatives like SPDX Lite. And perhaps this telco spec actually belongs as a profile in SPDX. Okay, and that discussion continued with a lot of text that I'm not going to paste into the chat, but you'll find it at the link I put into the chat a minute ago. And basically, it looks like the outcome for telco spec proposal is that they're going to have a meeting with the SPDX Lite team. So this telco spec is about SBOM quality. It looks like there's a lot of unanswered questions, and ultimately they need to have a meeting with the SPDX Lite team, which they'll try to do in the end of October in Monterey, to discuss what to do. And one option is that this proposal for an SBOM quality spec gets turned into a guide as opposed to a spec. Or, for instance, it becomes part of SPDX. Or, for instance, it becomes an independent spec, to be determined. But it looks like that group is not ready yet to hand it over to us. And Ninjoji-san has just posted a link if people want to dig into SPDX data. He's posted a link for SPDX Lite. Now, this isn't going to be central to our discussion, and I'm just opening it here so that people can see it if they're watching the video. But basically, the SPDX team is working on an SPDX Lite profile, which defines a minimal set of fields. So the telco spec is very much up in the air, so it's not central to our discussions at this juncture. They have to sort some stuff out and come back to us if they want us to consider it. And if they want us to consider it as a proposal, when they're ready, we'll have a kickoff call. But we still have to wait until after they have a meeting in Monterey. Thank you very much, Kubota-san, and also Ninjoji-san for sharing the SPDX link. So ultimately then, we're working on licensing, we're working on security updates, we're working on the proposal for contribution, and that has a lot more to do before it tidies up as a proposal. Telco looks like we have to wait and see where they're at. They've had a bit of a pause instead of being ready to come to us. So we'll give them time. Is there any other business apart from that? Any other business? All right. If not, then we're moving to the close of the meeting. Thank you, everyone. We covered a lot of really useful ground, and I hope you have a beautiful day. Let's talk again soon.
All right. Thank you, Shane.
Thanks,
Thank you
guys.
very much.
Pleasure.
Cheers.
Bye-bye.